Well, we talked about what tribal people can do for themselves, and I'd like to get to that sort of at the end. But there's a perception or something you hear, why doesn't somebody do something? Why doesn't the government do something? And then you hear the word neglect quite often and lack of funding. And we're the richest country in the world, apparently. I keep hearing that. And it seems to be, to me, a question of focus, attention, priorities, those kinds of cost, those kinds of things as to how some of these problems can get rectified or addressed. We didn't really mention specifically the fact that many villages have to move or are planning to move or trying to move because of rising waters and lack of sea ice and melting permafrost and all these things making basic life unsafe. Um, so, so where do we go from here? And what is the responsibility of the federal government? And why haven't they stepped up and fixed this, to ask kind of a silly question?
I ask that question frequently during Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath in New Orleans and all those areas that were heavily devastated. It shocked me that our response was so tepid. There was apparently a belief that it wasn't as serious as it needed to be. Um, and eventually the resources were placed there, but I still hear that there are places in Louisiana that have not recovered. I look at the earthquake in Puerto Rico, and the same thing, days and days and days of severe trauma inflicted upon the residents of Puerto Rico, and a very tepid response. So I think a lot of it has to do with the politicians. Many of them are uh, driven budgetarily, but budget to them is just the numbers on what they feel they have to spend. It's not on mitigation of all the negative consequences that accrue to a disaster in terms of human suffering, but actually in terms of impact to economies. There are two sides of the coin. The first is that had we responded appropriately to either of those disasters, there were huge commercial business interests that were engaged in the recovery that benefited to a substantial amount. Um, Interestingly enough, there were a couple of FEMA shelters in Nia Bay, a place where I spent some time as their tribal health director, that were uh, auctioned off, sold after the Katrina immediate issues had been felt. So someone had to build those. Someone had to install those. There is a huge economic impact and benefit to society in addressing these disasters, but the budget folks say we can't accrue debt, we can't spend money if we don't have money. So I think that's the major problem that we end up with. And then certain politicians that become executives are uh, administering so many silos, and the communication is so poor that they haven't come together to give a response. The same thing is true in every organization I have managed over the past 20 years. The number of compliance issues that we have to face for a small program, the one I administer now is about a $40 million company, is incredible. We have federal guidance on how we spend that funding. There are documents that tell us what we can do and what we can't do. The federal acquisition regulations, there's a lot of what we can do and what we can't do. When you look at the list of add-ons to any grant or contract, they are pages and pages and pages long. And so what happens with the federal government here is that they'll treat symptoms for a while because siloed organizations do that real well. So if we have something that is a symptom, the FEMA structure will go into place, and then there might be a response, sometimes quickly, sometimes not so quickly. But when we have all of these siloed programs with different areas of responsibility, one dealing with fuel, one dealing with healthcare, one dealing with transportation, one dealing with climate change, they all have to get together. And so what Congress has done is required FEMA, for example, to put together a risk mitigation plan in order to coordinate all of this. Now imagine you're sitting in a village of less than 400 people Very few college degrees, and those are typically working in the school or in the healthcare facilities. There's very little coordination, and then all of a sudden you're required to be the lead agency, either as a city or a tribal government, to put this all together. And so it takes sometimes years, if not decades, to put this stuff together, and then to get someone to listen is complex. The federal government would have an incredible impact on the state of Alaska economy if it fully funded relocation of Alaska Native villages. Right now, I think there are between 25 and 30 that are very close to having to relocate. Uh, the state of Alaska
Can you
economy would
name some of
benefit.
those briefly? Just give me a few so we can locate ourselves on a map.
Yes, if we're looking at villages that are relocating, Nutuk is one that is currently in the process of relocating. Um, Hooper Bay, a community that my organization works in, is now beginning to realize some of the um, issues related to erosion of riverine banks as a result of permafrost. Bethel itself has put in extensive uh, um, rock barriers to try to stop the river from eating into it as a community. Even Cordova, where my dad was born, has some issues that will accrue because of the retreat of glacial ice and water issues. Interestingly enough, when glaciers retreat, the land around it actually bounces up, so you don't have a subsidence problem. You have a come up in height problem. Quinnahock is another area, a lot of substandard housing. And so to try to figure out when a village will have funding to be able to move so that you don't build a lot of new housing in a community that has dilapidated housing and is in need of new housing is a huge issue. So a lot of communities, and I don't know all of the 25 to 30, I've not been to a great number of them, but you'll find them on the Kuskokwim and Yukon rivers as the permafrost begins um, melting. Then the river erodes a lot of places away. Buckland, which is not too far away from Kivalina, spent a good couple of weeks underwater predominantly. So we're going to have to be looking at other mitigation type impacts, because to move every village in Alaska is a huge expense, probably $500 million.
Yeah, I was hearing 100 million plus per village, depending on the size of the village. Is that anywhere remotely accurate?
Probably. A lot of villages are fairly small. Hooper Bay at 12 to 1300 would be very expensive. Nutuk is relatively expensive, and they've basically only moved about half of the village from the old village to the new site. And it's not just moving the people, Robert. You have to move the runways, you have to move the landing sites for barges, you have to develop the infrastructure. The school is the biggest expense. Building a new school in rural Alaska can be a $50 to $100 million expense by itself, depending on the number of kids that are in there. And then, of course, to have any sanitation, to do the infrastructure for trash disposal, for sewage disposal, that all has to be coordinated. And then again, if you, like Nutuk, you have people in two different locations, there are issues that healthcare have revealed when the new airport is at the new village site and the old airport is no longer functioning at the old village site. I think there's a significant 5-6 mile commute just to get to a medevac plane, and my understanding is that someone actually didn't make it as a consequence. So this gets down into a little bit of minutia and detail, but all of these major issues of coordination, of communication, of funding sources have to have some coordination that's not occurring in many of these cases. And so the solution is probably to do what the government frequently does, and that is to have interagency organizations that are set up as a separate structure to help these very small communities coordinate. I mean, I'm an attorney. I'm trained to look at technical documents. I'm trained to look at legal documents. And I get confused when I get into this huge morass of siloed programs, siloed funding sources, compliance requirements, submitting multiple applications at the same time, doing all of the engineering work, all of the uh, land work that has to be done in order to move a community. I mean, just simply the land issues alone, you have to find a suitable piece of land. You have to go in and do the surveys to find out if it's suitable. Remember, if there's permafrost in your current village, there's probably permafrost all over the area that you're at. So then you need to find a place to relocate that is not as bad as the one that you're moving from. And then on top of that, the new types of foundations that you have to put together have to insulate. And who knows what the permafrost will look like in 40 or 50 years. Those buildings that were intended to last that long could well have subsided by a significant amount.
Well, you mentioned the siloing and the administrative difficulties. And what was coming to my mind was every silo has a boss. Like there's somebody above all the silos, right?
Yes.
So I want to take this back to race. So Puerto Rico, brown people. New Orleans, brown people. Alaska, brown people. What role does this play in the decision making at the top level?
I think it plays a huge role. Um, and I'm not quite sure how to explain that. American Indians and Alaska Natives receive healthcare benefits through relationships with the federal government. Um, but the huge number of health issues that have accrued because of race, and understand that race is a source of historical trauma. And so when you are beaten because of your brown skin, when you are abused because of your brown skin, when I can give you an example from my life. Quite obviously, you can see my brown skin. Um, but when I was a boy, about 10 years old, my mother lost us to the state of Washington. We were taken away from her through their children's services. When you look at children's services in most states, and here in Alaska, 60–70% of the children taken away from parents are minority children. That is a huge event for the perpetration of toxic stress. In Alaska, 30% of our prison population, it's a little bit less than that, is Alaska Native males. And we are only about 19% of the population, but in the demographics of that 19%, a huge number of them, 40–50%, are less than 18 years of age. We have a very young population. So racism is very clearly a huge problem. And when it comes to spending in communities of color, we find that the spend is not significant and hindered by a lot of different barriers that are put up in front of the community. So you hit on a point that is very contentious. I currently work in the
Sure.
field of poverty, Robert, in the state of Washington. In their recently concluded task force on addressing poverty, found that there were two issues that needed to be addressed in order to help alleviate poverty. Alaska Natives are a huge percent of the poverty population in Alaska. But the two things that the state of Washington found was to address this historical trauma and to address racial inequality. So you've touched on a point that is been a long time in being addressed, but at least it's in some states like Washington State, it is now stepping forward as the root cause of one of the reasons for poverty existing. And of course, poverty makes it very difficult for anyone in a village that has to be relocated to get a new home. If you're only making 30,000 on average, which is the average wage or average household income in Kivalina, that's not going to support a house that could cost 6 to 7, 800,000 in another community. So there's really no chance that someone is going to be able to build a house in a new location and finance it through conventional sources, especially with all of the natural disaster potential that is hitting these communities.
Is that why there's no funding until the disaster happens and life and death are on the line on a daily basis and it's in the newspapers?
Pretty much so. First off, you have to get the attention of politicians who are immersed in all of their important issues of the day, like abortion and um, defense and their own individual drama. But there are politicians, and you and I had this conversation, there are a lot of them who are early adopters
Yeah.
of great ideas. And we're fortunate that there are politicians who are trying to think ahead and at least have the backbones of programs that might be um, available or switched or funded. So one of the programs that we have available in Alaska through um, the work of our late Senator Ted Stevens is the Denali Commission. The Denali Commission was a source of funding. It was one of these interagency funded entities that was addressing issues like sanitation and sewage and water in rural Alaska. So there's a lot of hope out there. The structures are in place. What it really takes is that conversation, elimination of silos. You mentioned each has a boss. Of course, each boss has their own ideas. And then they have to compete with the bigger bosses and the bigger bosses after that, who all have their own agendas to play out. Communication is critical and important at a time like this, and it's only now really starting, and it's being demanded by the American Indian Alaska Native community that climate issues be addressed because, as we've just demonstrated, we are severely affected and impacted by what's going on in climate change in this country and in this world today.
Well, as we discussed, what was it? Rogers' curve of innovation dissemination.
Yes,
So,
yes.
okay, let's just take it from the standpoint of we're all on our own. You're on your own. Kivalina is on its own. I'm on my own. Uh, how can we adapt our thinking to be more impactful around these issues as individuals?
The Rogers innovation curve was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book The Tipping Point. So people are familiar with it, but it's not being used as a tool. Uh, in this world, there or in this country, about 2.5% of the population have the ability to think innovatively and creatively, to put together lots of disparate information into a systems whole, and then to plot a pathway to achieving a certain goal or a result based on that knowledge. What I've seen in my experience is that innovative ideas take a long time to make their way into a general population. And so when I was somewhat teasingly saying I'm happy to talk to another early adopter, which you are, if not an innovator, it's because I realize that the pathway to impacting the majority of people in this country is through identifying early adopters, making them aware of their orbit of influence. So Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics for his study of cognitive biases. Your brain behaves in predictable patterns. And one of the predictable patterns, for example, is the affinity bias. Um, when I met you, you were a friend of mine. He liked you. I liked you immediately. That's an affinity bias. And then to hear the kinds of things that you were involved in took me to other biases uh, that form a bond, and then I'll go out and I will be sharing information with my circle of friends. And as we do that, I'll capture some people who are also early adopters and we'll work towards this early majority. We're doing that in climate change. The problem with climate change is that we have huge economic interests on the back end, and what Professor Rogers referred to the back end as laggards. people who have no incentive to change because they're benefiting tremendously from the existing circumstances. So with climate change, I'm beginning to see a little bit of the shift. I shared with you yesterday 2 resolutions that were recently passed by the Alaska Federation of Natives and the National Congress of American Indians. The early adopters in the American Indian Alaska Native community are now out there trying to influence the early adopters to begin to take a path of action to address climate change. People who are working on the Paris Accord initially and got it put together were the invaders. When they got enough people to agree to it, those were the early adopters, and now we're looking, and I think we're into the early majority. I don't know that we can wait to get to a substantial majority, but at least that we're at the point right now where we can begin to impact some of the most egregious symptoms of the systemic issue of climate change that's facing us. And I think that in order to change it effectively, we are also having to look at the mental health, the behavioral health of the people that are being severely impacted, and then their physical health. As I mentioned, if you're moving a community 18, 19, 20 miles away, which is what they're proposing for Kivalina, what does that do to their access to bowhead whales? What does that do to their access to a walrus? You are disrupting the community, and that's an additional adult acquired trauma that, if we just focus on the physical move, then we're missing a whole lot of what could impact that community for decades, if not centuries to come. Alaska Native people have had to adjust for centuries to changing circumstances and conditions. So back in the 1600s, as I told you yesterday, the people who now live in the native village of Hoona in southeast Alaska were actually living in Glacier Bay during an advance of glaciers. And it was a rapid advance. The local people, through the oral history, said that the glaciers were moving as fast as a dog runs. So they left the Glacier Bay area, relocated. Now those glaciers are receding as a part of the climate change that is occurring, but what's going to happen is that they won't be able to return to their traditional homelands because Glacier Bay is now a wilderness area. It's not accessible to people. In fact, cruise ships are limited to, I think, 1 hour in the bay itself. And so a lot of the issues faced by Alaska Natives is that because Alaska was such a pristine state back in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of it was set aside for federal purposes. It just gives me another argument for, if the feds have so much land here and are locking up so many resources, is it not a part of their obligation to return some of that resource value to Alaska Native communities that suffer because of their inability to develop those resources?
Well, I guess you could apply the same argument to oil companies.
Absolutely.
On the private side, you take all the profits, and what do you leave behind? What do you create in the place that's given you the largesse?
Typically, lots of problems. One of the problems that the military left behind after World War II is that they had a lot of chemicals, a lot of products that were left behind and buried. So I know in a lot of communities today, they look at many of these substances having lain in the community for decades and decades and decades as having a deleterious health effect on the community. Perhaps another reason for some of the higher rates of cancer in some Native communities. So, we live in a collective culture and a collective society, but so many of us, not me included, but so many believe that we should be left to our own devices and what we earn is ours. When in fact, as a system, every one of us is interconnected to a degree that most of us don't understand. I have one thing that struck me. Felix Cohen was one of the greatest Indian law scholars of all time. He was not American Indian himself, but I think he was a solicitor for Department of Interior, and he wrote the um, first handbook of American Indian law. But as a young college student, I remember a statement that he made. He talked about how we treat the American Indian as being analogous to the canary in a mine. Canaries were kept in mines to make sure that methane or other gases didn't impact the miners. And if the canary died, you were in serious trouble. American Indians were almost terminated during the 1950s. A lot of tribes lost their federal recognition and existence, lost their reservations, and have been staging a comeback. And understanding that how we treat the most unfortunate among us, American Indians having been dispossessed, having high rates of historical trauma, not being immune from the diseases that Europeans were immune to when they came over. So a huge die-off, the historical traumas that occurred really made American Indian and Alaska Native populations susceptible. And the resources have not really come in to address all of those issues. And you are right. What happened as American Indians were dispossessed is that huge stores of natural resources were unleashed and propelled the United States to economic prominence. And so I like Cohen's analogy. I like what he was talking about American Indians, Alaska Natives being the canary in the coal mine, is that if the health of American Indians improves, and if we're usually the last to be dealt with, then you can probably be assured that the health of almost everyone else in the country is improving as well.